Picture this. You're walking through a military base, minding your own business, when suddenly someone in uniform stops you and demands to know your rank. Your answer is so unexpected, so shocking, that it literally drains the color from their face. This isn't fiction. This isn't a movie scene. This is the true story of Major General Patricia Williams, whose simple two-word response to a Marine captain challenge became one of the most talked-about moments in military history. What happened next would expose decades of assumptions, challenge military protocol, and ultimately change how the armed forces view leadership forever. Some said it was about time. Others called it revolutionary. But everyone agreed on one thing. Nobody saw it coming. The question that started it all seemed innocent enough. The answer? Well, that's where our story truly begins. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton as Patricia Williams made her way through the administrative complex. At 52, she moved with the confident stride of someone who had earned every step of their journey through sheer determination and unwavering dedication. Her uniform was pristine, each ribbon and medal perfectly aligned, though few people who passed her that Tuesday morning truly understood the weight of what those decorations represented. Patricia had arrived at the base 3 days earlier for a joint operations briefing. The meeting itself had gone smoothly, but she had stayed behind to review some classified documents and coordinate with the intelligence team. It was routine work, the kind that required attention to detail and absolute discretion. She had specifically chosen to dress in standard battle dress uniform rather than her dress blues, preferring functionality over formality when working in the field. The corridor she walked through buzzed with the usual morning activity. Junior officers hurried past with briefcases and clipboards. Enlisted personnel moved equipment, and the steady hum of military efficiency filled the air. Patricia had always found comfort in this environment. The structured chaos, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that everyone around her was working towards something greater than themselves. It reminded her why she had dedicated her life to service. As she approached the security checkpoint near the classified briefing rooms, Patricia noticed a commotion near the main entrance. A group of Marines were processing a new batch of temporary personnel, checking credentials and assigning access badges. She recognized the standard procedure and continued on her path, her mind focused on the morning's agenda. Captain James Morrison had been having a frustrating morning. 3 new personnel had arrived without proper documentation. The computer system had crashed twice, and his superior had made it clear that any security breaches would be his responsibility. At 28, Morrison was considered a rising star in his unit, known for his attention to detail and strict adherence to protocol. He took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously according to some of his colleagues. When Morrison spotted Patricia approaching the checkpoint, something immediately struck him as odd. Here was someone in military uniform, walking with obvious authority, but he didn't recognize her. In his mind, this raised red flags. Fort Braxton maintained strict security protocols, especially in the classified areas. Everyone who belonged there should be familiar to him, or at least have visible identification. Patricia was examining a document as she walked, her attention partially diverted. She had reviewed these intelligence reports dozens of times, but something in the latest assessment troubled her. The information suggested a shift in enemy tactics that could impact ongoing operations. She was so absorbed in her analysis that she didn't immediately notice the Marine captain stepping into her path. Morrison cleared his throat loudly. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge of military authority. "I need to see some identification." Patricia looked up from her papers, mildly surprised by the interruption. She had assumed her presence in this area would be expected, given her scheduled meetings and the briefing she had been attending. "I'm sorry," she responded, genuinely confused by the request. Morrison's suspicion deepened. In his experience, anyone with legitimate business in this area would immediately understand the need for identification checks. The fact that this woman seemed surprised only confirmed his concerns. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. I need to verify your credentials and determine your business here." Other personnel in the area began to notice the interaction. A few junior officers slowed their pace, curious about what was developing. The Marines processing new personnel at the nearby checkpoint paused their work, sensing tension in the air. This kind of confrontation was unusual, especially involving someone who clearly appeared to be a senior military member. Patricia realized that the captain didn't recognize her, which wasn't entirely surprising. Fort Braxton was a large installation, and she hadn't been stationed there permanently. Still, she found his aggressive tone somewhat off-putting. "Captain," she said calmly, "I'm here for the joint operations briefing. I believe there's been some miscommunication." Morrison wasn't satisfied with this response. He had checked the roster of attendees for the joint operations briefing, and while there were several high-ranking officials expected, none of them matched the woman standing before him. His training told him to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him something wasn't right. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your identification card and your access authorization," Morrison insisted, his voice growing firmer. "Standard protocol requires all personnel in this area to verify their credentials upon request." The situation was beginning to attract more attention. Several Marines from Morrison's unit had moved closer, ready to assist if needed. The processing checkpoint had essentially stopped functioning as personnel focused on the developing confrontation. Patricia could sense the tension rising and realized that this was escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. What Morrison didn't know, and what none of the gathering personnel could have guessed, was that Patricia Williams had spent the last 30 years climbing through the ranks of military leadership. She had served in 3 combat deployments, commanded thousands of troops, and earned the respect of generals and admirals across all branches of service. Her rise through the ranks had been marked by exceptional performance, innovative strategic thinking, and an unwavering commitment to the mission. Patricia had started her military career as a second lieutenant fresh out of the academy. Like many young officers, she had faced skepticism and challenges, some of which had more to do with her gender than her capabilities. But she had proven herself time and, again, earning promotions based on merit and results. Her early assignments in logistics and operations management had given her a comprehensive understanding of military structure and process. Her first combat deployment had been a defining experience. As a captain, she had been responsible for coordinating supply lines in a hostile environment. When enemy forces had disrupted traditional routes, Patricia had developed alternative strategies that kept critical supplies flowing to frontline units. Her innovative approach had been studied and adopted by other units, establishing her reputation as a problem solver and strategic thinker. Subsequent assignments had taken her around the world. She had served as an operations officer in Europe, a strategic planner in the Pacific, and a base commander in the Middle East. Each position had brought new challenges and opportunities to prove her leadership capabilities. Her superiors consistently rated her performance as exceptional, noting her ability to adapt to changing circumstances and her talent for inspiring confidence in subordinates. The promotion to colonel had come after a particularly successful operation where Patricia had coordinated a complex multi-unit mission that achieved all objectives with minimal casualties. The operation had required precise timing, innovative tactics, and seamless coordination between different branches of the military. Patricia's role in planning and executing the mission had earned her recognition at the highest levels of command. But it was her performance as a colonel that had truly set her apart. Given command of a large installation, Patricia had transformed what had been considered an underperforming base into a model of efficiency and effectiveness. She had identified systemic problems that previous commanders had overlooked, implemented new training protocols, and fostered a culture of excellence that had dramatically improved performance metrics. Her approach to leadership had been both firm and compassionate. Patricia believed in holding people accountable while also providing them with the resources and support they needed to succeed. She had spent countless hours mentoring junior officers, sharing the lessons she had learned throughout her career. Many of those officers had gone on to distinguished careers of their own, crediting Patricia with helping them develop their leadership skills. The recommendation for promotion to general officer rank had come from multiple sources. Her immediate superiors had praised her strategic vision and operational excellence. Peers had noted her collaborative approach and her ability to work effectively across organizational boundaries. Subordinates had highlighted her fairness and her commitment to their professional development. The promotion process itself had been rigorous. Patricia had undergone extensive evaluations, interviews, and assessments. Military boards had reviewed her entire career, examining every assignment, every evaluation, every recommendation. The process had taken months, but the outcome had been unanimous. Patricia Williams had earned her star. Standing in that corridor at Fort Braxton, facing a Marine captain who didn't recognize her authority, Patricia reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She understood Morrison's position and respected his commitment to security protocols. But she also knew that this situation was about to take a turn that would surprise everyone involved. Morrison continued to wait for her identification, his patience wearing thin. The Marines who had gathered nearby were watching intently, unsure of how this confrontation would resolve. The administrative personnel who had stopped their work were beginning to whisper among themselves, speculating about what was happening. Patricia made a decision. Rather than produce her identification immediately, she would answer Morrison's question directly. It wasn't ego or defiance that motivated her choice. Instead, it was a recognition that this moment represented something larger than a simple security check. This was an opportunity to challenge assumptions and demonstrate that leadership comes in many forms. She looked Morrison directly in the eye, her expression calm but serious. The corridor had grown quiet, as if everyone present sensed that something significant was about to happen. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to spotlight the two figures facing each other, one demanding answers, the other preparing to provide one that would change everything. Morrison's training had prepared him for many situations, but not for this one. He had confronted unauthorized personnel before, dealt with confused visitors, and handled various security breaches. His confidence in his ability to manage this situation was absolute. He had no reason to believe that the next few seconds would become one of the most memorable moments of his military career. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone present knew that they were witnessing something unusual, though none of them could have predicted what was about to unfold. Patricia took a slight breath, preparing to deliver the response that would transform this routine security check into a moment that would be talked about for years to come. Morrison leaned forward slightly, his expression stern and expectant. He was ready to process whatever identification this woman provided and move on with his day. He had no idea that her next words would challenge everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy and leadership. Patricia's voice was steady and clear when she finally spoke. "Captain, my rank is Major General." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Morrison's face went through a series of rapid changes, starting with confusion, moving through disbelief, and, finally, settling into a pale shade of shock that drained all color from his features. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The confident posture he had maintained throughout the confrontation crumbled in an instant. The Marines who had gathered to watch the exchange stood frozen in stunned silence. Several of them exchanged glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. The administrative personnel who had been observing from a distance moved closer, drawn by the dramatic shift in atmosphere that had swept through the corridor. Morrison's military training kicked in, even as his mind struggled to process what had just happened. Major General. That meant this woman outranked not only him, but his commanding officer and his commanding officer's commanding officer. She was 3 full ranks above him in the military hierarchy. The implications of his aggressive questioning began to dawn on him with crushing clarity. "Ma'am," Morrison managed to stammer, his voice barely above a whisper. I apologize. I didn't realize." He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. His hands, which had been confidently positioned on his duty belt, now hung awkwardly at his sides. Patricia observed the captain's reaction with a mixture of understanding and concern. She had seen this response before, though rarely so dramatically. The military's hierarchical structure was designed to maintain order and discipline, but moments like this highlighted some of its limitations. She realized that Morrison's shock went beyond simple embarrassment about challenging a superior officer. "Captain Morrison," Patricia said, having noted his nameplate during their interaction, "you were following proper security protocols. I understand your position." Her tone was measured and professional, designed to defuse the tension that had built up in the corridor. But Morrison was beyond consolation at that moment. His mind was racing through the potential consequences of his actions. He had aggressively questioned a general officer, demanded identification in a tone that bordered on accusatory, and essentially treated one of the military's most senior leaders like a potential security threat. The ramifications for his career seemed catastrophic. The Marines who had been watching the exchange began to shift uncomfortably. They too were beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred. Several of them had participated in the questioning by their presence and support of Morrison's actions. The reality of the situation was sinking in for everyone involved. Word of the incident began to spread rapidly through the administrative complex. Military installations are notorious for the speed at which news travels, and this story was too dramatic to remain contained. Within minutes, personnel from different units were making their way to the area, drawn by reports of a confrontation involving a general officer. Patricia recognized that the situation was spiraling beyond a simple misunderstanding. The growing crowd of onlookers and the visible distress of Captain Morrison indicated that this moment was becoming something much larger than either of them had intended. She made a decision to take control of the narrative before it became even more complicated. "Captain," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came with decades of leadership experience, "I'd like to speak with you privately. Is there an office we can use?" Morrison nodded quickly, grateful for the opportunity to move the conversation away from the growing audience. "Yes, ma'am. This way, please." He led her toward a small conference room adjacent to the security checkpoint, his movements stiff and uncertain. As they walked, Patricia noticed how the other personnel reacted to her presence. Now that her rank had been revealed, their demeanor changed completely. Marines snapped to attention. Junior officers moved aside respectfully, and the general buzz of conversation was replaced by a hushed reverence. The transformation was immediate and total. Inside the conference room, Morrison struggled to find the right words to address what had happened. Patricia took a seat and gestured for him to do the same, recognizing that he needed to be put at ease before any productive conversation could occur. "Captain," she began, "I want you to understand that you did nothing wrong. Your job is to maintain security, and that's exactly what you were doing. The fact that you didn't recognize me isn't a failure on your part." Morrison looked up at her with obvious relief, though his embarrassment was still clearly visible. "Thank you, ma'am. But I should have. The way I spoke to you." Patricia held up a hand to stop him. "Let's talk about what really happened here. You saw someone you didn't recognize in a secure area, and you followed protocol by requesting identification. That's good soldiering. The issue isn't with your actions, it's with the assumptions that led to those actions." This comment seemed to confuse Morrison. He had expected a reprimand or at least a stern lecture about proper respect for senior officers. Instead, the general was talking about assumptions. "I'm not sure I understand, ma'am." Patricia leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. Captain, when you first saw me in that corridor, what did you think? What was your immediate impression? Morrison hesitated, unsure of how to answer honestly without potentially offending her further. I thought you were someone who didn't belong there. Someone who might be lost or confused about where they were supposed to be. And why did you think that? Patricia pressed. The question forced Morrison to examine his own thought process, something that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. I guess because I didn't recognize you, and I thought I knew all the senior personnel who would be in that area. Patricia nodded. That's part of it. But there's more, isn't there? When you looked at me, what did you see? Morrison was beginning to understand where this conversation was heading, and it made him even more uncomfortable than the initial confrontation had. Ma'am, I saw someone in uniform who I didn't recognize. Captain, I need you to be completely honest with me. This isn't about punishment or reprimands. This is about understanding. When you first saw me, did my gender influence your initial assessment? The question hit Morrison like a physical blow. He sat back in his chair, his mind racing through the moments leading up to their confrontation. Had he made assumptions based on Patricia's gender? Had he approached her differently than he would have approached a male officer of similar apparent age and experience? I don't know, Morrison admitted. I'd like to think it didn't, but I can't be completely sure. Patricia appreciated his honesty. I've been in the military for 30 years, Captain. I've encountered situations like this before, though rarely so dramatically. What happened in that corridor wasn't just about security protocols or recognition. It was about assumptions and expectations. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the military installation bustling with activity. When people see me, they often see what they expect to see rather than what's actually there. I don't fit the traditional image of a general officer, so even when I'm in uniform, even when I carry myself with military bearing, some people assume I must be something other than what I am. Morrison was beginning to grasp the larger implications of what had occurred. Ma'am, I think I understand what you're saying. And if I made assumptions based on anything other than proper military protocol, I sincerely apologize. Patricia turned back to face him. Captain, I'm not looking for apologies. I'm looking for understanding. This incident didn't happen in isolation. It's part of a larger pattern that exists throughout the military and society as a whole. The question is, what do we do with this moment? The door to the conference room opened, and Colonel Robert Hayes, Morrison's commanding officer, entered with obvious urgency. He had clearly heard about the incident and had come to assess the situation. When he saw Patricia, his expression immediately became respectful and concerned. General Williams, Hayes said, coming to attention, I heard there was some kind of misunderstanding. I want to assure you that we'll investigate this matter thoroughly and take appropriate action. Patricia gestured for the colonel to take a seat. Colonel Hayes, isn't it? I've heard good things about your unit. Please sit down. Captain Morrison and I were just discussing what happened, and I think there are some important lessons here for all of us. Hayes looked between Patricia and Morrison, trying to assess the situation. He had expected to find an angry general officer and a captain in serious trouble. Instead, he found what appeared to be a thoughtful discussion taking place. Ma'am, Hayes said carefully, I want to apologize for any disrespect shown to you by my personnel. Captain Morrison is normally very professional, and I can't explain what happened here. Patricia held up her hand. Colonel, that's exactly the problem. You're assuming that what happened was disrespectful or unprofessional. Captain Morrison was doing his job. The real issue is more complex than that. She began to explain her perspective on the incident, describing how assumptions and expectations had played a role in the confrontation. As she spoke, both officers began to understand that they were being presented with an opportunity to examine their own biases and preconceptions. Gentlemen, Patricia continued, I could write this off as a simple case of mistaken identity. I could accept your apologies and move on with my day, but that would be a wasted opportunity. What happened in that corridor happens every day in different ways throughout our military. It's time we addressed it directly. The conversation continued for over an hour. Patricia shared examples from her own career, describing situations where she had been underestimated, overlooked, or assumed to be something other than what she was. She talked about the additional challenges faced by women and minorities in military leadership roles, and how these challenges often manifested in subtle ways that were easy to dismiss or ignore. Morrison found himself opening up about his own experiences and observations. He described instances where he had witnessed female officers being treated differently than their male counterparts, often in ways that were so subtle they could be explained away as coincidence or misunderstanding. The conversation was uncomfortable at times, but it was also enlightening. Colonel Hayes contributed his own observations and experiences. As a senior officer, he had seen the military evolve significantly over his career, but he acknowledged that progress had been uneven and that challenges remained. The three officers found themselves engaged in the kind of honest discussion that rarely occurred across such different levels of rank and experience. As their conversation drew to a close, Patricia made a proposal that would surprise both men. Rather than treating this incident as a problem to be solved or a mistake to be corrected, she suggested treating it as a learning opportunity that could benefit the entire installation. Her idea was ambitious and would require careful implementation, but it had the potential to create positive change that extended far beyond the individuals involved in the original confrontation. The room fell silent as Morrison and Hayes considered her proposal. What had started as a routine security check had evolved into a moment of genuine reflection and potential transformation. The question now was whether they were ready to take the next step and turn this awkward encounter into something meaningful for their entire military community. Patricia's proposal was both simple and revolutionary. Instead of burying the incident or treating it as an isolated mistake, she wanted to use it as the foundation for a comprehensive leadership development program. Her idea was to create a series of workshops and discussions that would help military personnel examine their own assumptions and biases while also improving their ability to recognize and appreciate diverse forms of leadership. What I'm suggesting, Patricia explained to Morrison and Colonel Hayes, is that we turn this uncomfortable moment into an educational opportunity. We develop a program that helps people understand how unconscious bias affects their interactions and decision-making, particularly in military settings where hierarchy and protocol are so important. Morrison was intrigued but uncertain. Ma'am, how would something like that work? I mean, how do you teach people to recognize their own assumptions? Patricia smiled, recognizing the genuine curiosity in his question. That's exactly the right question, Captain. The first step is creating awareness. Most people don't realize when they're making assumptions based on appearance, gender, age, or other factors. They think they're being objective, but they're actually filtering their perceptions through their own experiences and expectations. Colonel Hayes leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. General, are you thinking about something formal, like mandatory training? Or would this be more voluntary and discussion-based? I'm thinking about something more sophisticated than typical diversity training, Patricia replied. This would be experiential learning, where people actually work through scenarios and examine their own responses. We'd use case studies, role-playing exercises, and guided discussions to help people identify their blind spots. The idea began to take shape as the three officers continued their conversation. Patricia outlined her vision for a program that would be integrated into existing leadership development curricula rather than being treated as a separate, optional add-on. The program would be designed to help military personnel at all levels become more effective leaders by expanding their understanding of how different people contribute to mission success. Over the following weeks, Patricia worked with Colonel Hayes and his team to develop the framework for what would eventually be called the Leadership Recognition Initiative. The program was designed around the principle that effective military leadership required the ability to recognize and utilize the diverse strengths and perspectives of all personnel, regardless of their background or appearance. Captain Morrison became an unexpected advocate for the program. His experience of confronting Patricia had been profoundly educational, forcing him to examine his own assumptions and biases in ways he had never done before. He volunteered to share his story as part of the training, describing both his initial reactions and his subsequent learning process. I realized that I had been making judgments based on incomplete information, Morrison explained during one of the pilot sessions. I thought I was following protocol, but I was actually responding to my own expectations about what a general officer should look like. It was a humbling experience, but also an important one. The pilot program was launched at Fort Braxton 3 months after the initial incident. The response was mixed at first, with some personnel viewing it skeptically as another mandatory training requirement. However, as word spread about the program's practical approach and its connection to actual leadership effectiveness, interest grew significantly. The program's success at Fort Braxton caught the attention of senior military leadership across all branches of service. Patricia was invited to present her initiative at several high-level conferences, where she shared both the original incident that inspired the program and the positive results they had achieved in its implementation. During one particularly memorable presentation, Patricia described the moment when Captain Morrison had challenged her in the corridor. His face went completely ashen when I told him my rank, she explained to an audience of colonels and generals. But that moment of shock became the beginning of a conversation that has had far-reaching implications for how we approach leadership development. The audience was captivated by her description of transforming an awkward confrontation into a learning opportunity. Many of them had experienced similar situations, either as the person making assumptions or as the person whose authority was questioned based on appearance rather than credentials. General Robert Martinez, who was attending the presentation, raised a question that many in the audience were thinking. General Williams, do you think incidents like this are becoming more common, or are we just more aware of them now? Patricia considered the question carefully before responding. I think these incidents have always occurred, but we're finally at a point where we can discuss them openly and learn from them. The military has always prided itself on meritocracy, but we haven't always been honest about the factors that influence how we perceive merit and leadership capability. Her answer sparked a lively discussion among the assembled officers. Many shared their own experiences with situations where assumptions had led to misunderstandings or missed opportunities. The conversation revealed that Patricia's experience was far from unique, and that there was significant interest in developing better approaches to address these challenges. Within 6 months, the Leadership Recognition Initiative had been adopted by 12 military installations across the country. Each implementation was customized to fit the specific needs and culture of the installation, but all were built around the core principle of helping personnel recognize and overcome unconscious biases that could impact their effectiveness as leaders and team members. Captain Morrison found his role in the program expanding beyond what he had initially expected. His honest account of the original incident and his subsequent learning process resonated with many participants. He was promoted to major and assigned to help develop advanced modules for the program, working directly with Patricia's team. I never imagined that one of the most embarrassing moments of my career would become one of the most meaningful, Morrison reflected during a program evaluation meeting. But I've learned that growth often comes from uncomfortable experiences if we're willing to learn from them. The program's impact extended beyond individual awareness and behavior change. Units that participated in the Leadership Recognition Initiative reported improved communication, better collaboration across diverse teams, and increased confidence among personnel who had previously felt undervalued or overlooked. One particularly striking example came from a logistics unit where a young female sergeant had developed an innovative solution to a persistent supply chain problem. Under the old culture, her suggestions might have been dismissed or credited to someone else. However, after participating in the Leadership Recognition Initiative, her commanding officer not only implemented her solution, but also ensured she received proper recognition for her contribution. Patricia continued to monitor the program's development and impact as it spread throughout the military. She was particularly interested in long-term outcomes and worked with military researchers to conduct comprehensive studies of the program's effectiveness. The data they collected showed consistent improvements in leadership effectiveness, team cohesion, and overall mission performance. 2 years after the initial incident, Patricia was invited to speak at the Naval War College about leadership development in the modern military. During her presentation, she reflected on how a simple misunderstanding had evolved into a comprehensive program that was changing military culture. Leadership isn't just about rank or position, she told the audience of senior officers. It's about the ability to recognize and develop the potential in everyone around you, regardless of whether they fit your preconceived notions of what a leader should look like. She described visiting units that had implemented the program and seeing the tangible changes in how personnel interacted with each other. Stories of improved mentorship, increased innovation, and better utilization of diverse talents were becoming common throughout the military. Captain Morrison, now Major Morrison, was in the audience for that presentation. After Patricia finished speaking, he approached her during the reception. "Ma'am," he said, "I wanted to thank you again for turning what could have been a career-ending mistake into a learning opportunity." Patricia smiled. "Major, you made that choice yourself. I just provided the framework. Your willingness to examine your own assumptions and share your experience with others is what made the real difference." Their conversation was overheard by several other officers who were curious about the program and its origins. Soon, Patricia and Morrison found themselves surrounded by a group of senior military leaders who wanted to hear more about the Leadership Recognition Initiative and how they might implement similar programs in their own commands. The impact of that morning confrontation at Fort Braxton continued to ripple outward. Military leadership academies began incorporating elements of the program into their curricula. Professional military education courses added modules on unconscious bias and inclusive leadership. The conversation that had started in a corridor continued in classrooms, conference rooms, and command centers around the world. Patricia's career continued to advance, and she eventually became one of the most senior officers in her branch of service. However, she remained committed to the Leadership Recognition Initiative and continued to advocate for programs that helped military personnel develop more effective and inclusive leadership skills. 5 years after the initial incident, Patricia received a letter from a young lieutenant who had participated in the program early in her career. The letter described how the program had helped her recognize her own potential and pursue leadership opportunities she might not have considered otherwise. More importantly, it described how she was now using the program's principles to mentor other young officers and help them develop their own leadership capabilities. "Your program didn't just change how I saw others," the lieutenant wrote. "It changed how I saw myself and what I was capable of achieving." Patricia kept that letter in her desk drawer, along with dozens of others like it. Each one represented a person whose life had been touched by the conversation that had started with Captain Morrison's challenge in the corridor. Each one was evidence that uncomfortable moments, when handled with wisdom and courage, could become catalysts for positive change. The story of Major General Patricia Williams and Captain Morrison became legendary within military circles, not because of the dramatic moment when she revealed her rank, but because of what they chose to do with that moment afterward. It became a case study in transforming conflict into growth, embarrassment into education, and misunderstanding into meaningful change. Today, the Leadership Recognition Initiative continues to evolve and expand. It has been adapted for use in civilian organizations, educational institutions, and government agencies. The core principle remains the same. Effective leadership requires the ability to recognize and develop potential wherever it exists, regardless of whether it comes in the package we expect. Patricia often reflects on that Tuesday morning at Fort Braxton when she walked down a corridor reviewing intelligence reports, never imagining that a simple security check would become the foundation for one of the military's most successful leadership development programs. She learned that sometimes the most important moments in our careers are the ones we never see coming, and that our response to unexpected challenges often defines our legacy more than our planned achievements. The transformation that began with 2 words, Major General, continues to influence military culture and leadership development around the world. It stands as a testament to the power of turning difficult conversations into opportunities for growth, and the importance of leaders who are willing to use their own experiences to help others become more effective and inclusive leaders. Major Morrison, now Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, continues to work with leadership development programs throughout the military. He often tells new participants that his most important lesson came not from a textbook or a lecture, but from a moment of profound embarrassment that forced him to examine his own assumptions and biases. That moment of going Ashen, he explains, was the beginning of becoming a better leader and a better person.